So, hello and welcome back. We are back yet again in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A, I was gonna say novel, but honestly, looking at how short it is, I would say in today's world, this would be more of a novella or maybe even just a long short story by Robert Louis Stevenson. It was written back in the 1800s and is one of the first, I mean, not one of the first, like, really popular, I would say, kind of horror novels. I mean, there was Dracula and there was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They were kind of the big ones that launched 1,000 Stephen Kings, I would say. Anyway, seems like things are getting a little bit more intense. I mean, we haven't seen Mr. Hyde in over a year, but things with Dr. Jekyll seem to be going deeply south as he has gone back into hiding, and one of the lawyer and his good friends just passed away after some sort of a grave shock suffered after speaking to Dr. Jekyll. So that is pretty much where we are at, and we are going to be reading chapters 7 and 8 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Oh, and chapter 7 is titled Incident at the Window. It chanced on Sunday, when Mr. Utterson was on his usual walk with Mr. Enfield, that their way once again through the by-street, and that when they came in front of the door, they both stopped to gaze on it. "Well," said Enfield, "that story's at an end at least. We shall see no more of Mr. Hyde." "I hope not," said Utterson. "Did I ever tell you that I once saw him and shared your feeling of repulsion?" "It is impossible to do one without the other," said Enfield. "And by the way, what an ass you must have thought me not to know that this was a back way to Dr. Jekyll's. It was partly your own fault that I found out, even when I did." "So you found out, did you?" said Utterson. "But it that must be so. We may step into the court and take a look at the windows. To tell you the truth, I am uneasy about poor Jekyll, and even outside, I feel as if the presence of a friend might do him good." The court was a little cool and a little damp, and full of premature twilight, although the sky high up overhead was still bright with sunset. The middle one of the three windows was halfway open, and sitting close beside it, taking the air with an infinite sadness of mien, like some disconsolate prisoner, Utterson saw Dr. Jekyll. "What, Jekyll?" he cried. "I trust you are better." "I am very low, Utterson," said the doctor drearily. "Very low. It will not last long, thank God." "You stay too much indoors," said the lawyer. "You should be out, whipping up the circulation like Mr. Enfield and me. This is my cousin, Mr. Enfield, Dr. Jekyll. Come now, get your hat and take a quick turn with us." "You are very good," said the other man. "I should like to very much, but no, 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 it is quite impossible. I dare not. But indeed, Utterson, I am very glad to see you. This is really a great pleasure. I would ask you and Mr. Enfield up, but the place is really not fit." "Why then," said the lawyer good-naturedly, The best thing we can do is stay down here and speak with you from where we are." "That is what I was just about to propose," said the doctor with a smile. But the words were hardly uttered before the smile was struck off of his face and succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair as froze the very blood of the two gentlemen below. They saw it but for a glimpse, for the window was instantly thrust down, but that glimpse had been sufficient, and they turned and left the court without a word. In silence, too, they traversed the by-street, and it was not until they had come into a neighboring thoroughfare, where even upon a Sunday there were still some stirrings of life, that Mr. Utterson at last turned and looked at his companion. They were both pale, and there was answering horror in their eyes. "God forgive us! God forgive us!" said Mr. Utterson. But Mr. Enfield only nodded his head very seriously and walked on once more in silence. That was a very, very, very short chapter. We might just end up finishing this book tonight. We'll have to see. Moving on to chapter 8. The Last Night. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. "Why, bless me, Poole, what brings you here?" he cried. And then, taking another look at him, "What ails you?" he said. "Is the doctor ill?" "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there's something wrong." "Take a seat, and here's a glass of wine for you," said the lawyer. "Now take your time and tell me plainly what you want." "You know the doctor's ways, sir," said Poole, "and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid." "Now, my good man," said the lawyer, "be explicit. What are you afraid of?" "I've been afraid for about a week," said Mr. Poole, doggedly disregarding the question, "and I can bear it no more." The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worst, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. Even now he sat with the glass of wine untasted on his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor. "I can bear it no more," he repeated. "Come," said the lawyer. "I see you have some good reason, Poole. I see there is something seriously amiss. Please tell me what it is." "I think there has been foul play," said Poole hoarsely. "Foul play!" cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened, and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. "What foul play? What does the man mean?" "I daren't say, sir," was the answer. "But will you come along with me and see for yourself?" Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and greatcoat, but he observed with wonder the greatness of the relief that appeared on the butler's face, and perhaps with no less that the wine was still untasted when he set it down. It was a wild, cool, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and a flying wrack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. The wind made talking difficult, and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets, unusually bare of passers. Besides, for Utterson thought, he had never seen that part of London so deserted. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been so conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures, for struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. The square, when they got there, was all full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Poole, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of his coming, these were not the dews of exertion he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish, for his face was white, and his voice, when he spoke, harsh and broken. "Well, sir," he said, "here we are, and God grant there is nothing wrong." "Amen, Poole," said the lawyer. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice said from within, "Is that you, Poole?" "It's all right," said Poole. "Open the door." The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the household broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook cried out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson!" and ran forward as though to take him in her arms. What? Are you all here?" said the lawyer. "Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased." "They're all afraid," said Poole. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. "Hold your tongue," Poole told her, with a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they had all started and turned towards the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. "And now," continued the butler, addressing the knife boy, "reach me a candle, and we'll get this through hands at once." And then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him, and led the way into the back garden. "Now, sir," said he, "you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go." Mr. Utterson's nerves, at this unlooked-for termination, gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. But he recollected his courage, and he followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theater, with its lumber of crates and bottles, to the foot of the stair. Here, Poole motioned him to stand to one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call upon his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red blaze of the cabinet door. "Mr. Utterson asking to see you," he called. And even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to listen. A voice came from within. "Tell him I cannot see him. Anyone," it said. "Thank you, sir," said Poole, with a note of something like triumph in his voice, and taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen, where the fire was set out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. "Sir," he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eye, "was that my master's voice?" "It seems much changed," said the lawyer, pale, but giving the man look for look. "Changed? Well, yes, I think so," said the butler. "Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? No, sir. Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson." This is a very strange tale, Poole. This is a rather wild tale, my man, said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. Suppose it were as you suppose, supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered. What would induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason. Well, Mr. Utterson, you're a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet, said Poole. All this last week, you must know, him or it or whatever it is that lives in that cabinet has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine, and it cannot get it into its mind. It was sometimes his way, my master's, that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it to the stair. We've had nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody's looking. Well, sir, every day, twice, thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints, and I've been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it because it was not pure, and another order of a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for. Have you any of the papers? Said Mr. Utterson. Poole felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending nearer to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus: Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Messrs. Maw. He assures them that their last sample is impure and quite useless for his present purposes. In the year 18 Dr. J purchased a somewhat large quantity from Messrs. M. He now begs them to search with the most salacious care, should any of the same quality be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this to Dr. J can hardly be exaggerated. So far, the letter had run composedly enough, but here, with a sudden sputter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. For God's sake, he had added, find me some of the old. This is a strange note, said Mr. Utterson. And then sharply, how did you come to have it open? The man at Maw's was main angry, sir. He threw it back at me like it were so much dirt, said Poole. This is unquestionably Dr. Jekyll's hand, do you know? I thought it looked like it, said the servant, sulkily, and then with a different voice, but what matters is the hand of right. I've seen him. Seen him, said Mr. Utterson. Well? That's it, said Poole. It was this way. I came suddenly into the theater from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for this drug or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in and gave a kind of cry and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. It was for but one moment that I saw him, but the hair stood up on my head like quills. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? I have served him long enough. And then... The man paused and passed his hand over his face. These are all very strange circumstances, said Mr. Utterson, but I think I begin to see daylight. Your master, Poole, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice, hence the mask and the avoidance of his friends, hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant he not be deceived. There's my explanation. It is sad enough, Poole, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural, and hangs well together, and delivers us from all exorbitant alarm. Sir, said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor, that thing was not my master, and that's the truth. My master. Here he looked around and began to whisper, is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf. Utterson attempted to protest. Oh, sir, cried Poole, do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door, where I saw him every morning of my life? No, sir. That thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll, and it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done. Poole, replied the lawyer, if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, much as I am puzzled by this note which seems to prove him to be still alive, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door. Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's a talkin', cried the butler. And now comes the second question, resumed Utterson. Who is going to do it? Why, you and me, came the reply. That is very well said, returned the lawyer. And whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see that you are no loser. There's an axe in the theater, continued Poole, and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself. The lawyer took that rude but weighty instrument into his hand and balanced it. Do you know, Poole, he said, looking up, that you and I are about to place ourselves in a position of some peril? You may say so, sir, indeed, said the butler. It is well, then, that we should be frank, said the lawyer. We both think more than we have said. Let us make a clean breast. The masked figure you saw, did you recognize it? Well, sir, it went so quick, and the creature was so doubled up, I could hardly swear to that. But if you mean, was it Mr. Hyde, why, yes, I think it was. You see, it was much of the same bigness, and it had the same quick, light way with it, and then who else could have gotten in by the laboratory door? You have not forgot, sir, at the time of the murder, he still had a key with him. But that is not all. I don't know, Mr. Utterson, if you ever met this Mr. Hyde. Yes, said the lawyer. I once spoke with him. Then you must know, as well as the rest of us, that there was something queer about that gentleman, something that gave a man a turn. I don't rightly know how to say it beyond this, that you feel in your marrow a kind of cold and thinness. I own that I felt something of what you describe, said Mr. Utterson. Quite so, sir, said Poole. Well, when that masked thing, like a monkey, jumped from amongst the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson. I'm book-learned enough for that, but a man has his feelings, and I give you my Bible word, it was Mr. Hyde. Aye, said the lawyer. My fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded. Evil was sure to come of that connection. Aye, truly I believe you. I believe poor Harry is killed, and I believe his murderer, for what purpose God alone can tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Well, let our name be Vengeance. Call Bradshaw. The footman came at this summons, very white and nervous. Pull yourself together, Bradshaw, said the lawyer. This suspense, I know, is telling upon all of you, but it is now our intention to make an end of it. Poole here and I are going to force our way into the cabinet. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. Meanwhile, lest anything should be really amiss, or any malfeasor seek to escape by the back, you and the boy must go around the corner with a pair of good sticks and take your post at the laboratory door. We'll give you 10 minutes to get to your station. As Bradshaw left, the lawyer looked at his watch. And now, Poole, let us get to ours, he said, and taking the poker under his arm, led his way into the yard. The scud had banked over the moon, and it was now quite dark. The wind, which only broke in puffs and draughts into the deep well of the building, tossed the light of the candle to and fro about their steps until they came to the shelter of the theater, where they sat down silently to wait. London hummed solemnly all around, but nearer at hand the stillness was only broken by the sounds of a footfall moving to and fro on the cabinet floor. "So it will walk all day, sir," whispered Poole. "Aye, and the better part of the night. Only when a new sample comes from the chemist there's a bit of a break. Ah, it's an ill conscience that such an enemy could rest. Ah, sir, there's blood foully shed in every step of it. But hark again, a little closer. Put your heart in your ears, Mr. Utterson, and tell me, is that the doctor's footfall?" The steps fell oddly and lightly, with a certain swing. For all they went so slowly, it was very different indeed from the heavy, creaking tread of Henry Jekyll. Utterson sighed. "Is there never anything else?" he asked. Poole nodded. "Once," he said. "Once I heard it weeping." "Weeping? How that?" said the lawyer, conscious of a sudden chill of horror. "Weeping like a woman or a lost soul," said the butler. "I came away with that upon my heart, and I could have wept too." But now the 10 minutes drew to an end. Poole disinterred the axe from under a stack of packing straw. The candle was set upon the nearest table to lighten them to the attack, and they drew near with bated breath to where the patient foot was still going up and down in the quiet of the night. "Jekyll," cried Utterson in a loud voice, "I demand to see you." He paused a moment, but there came no reply. "I give you fair warning. Our suspicions are aroused, and I must and shall see you," he resumed. "If not by fair means, then by foul. If not of your consent, then by brute force." "Utterson," said the voice, "for God's sake, have mercy." "Ah, that's not Jekyll's voice, it's Hyde," cried Utterson. "Down with the door, Poole." Poole swung the axe over his shoulder. The blow shook the building, and the red baize door leaped against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech, as of mere animal terror, rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough, and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst in sunder and the wreck of the door fell inward on the carpet. The besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered in. There lay the cabinet before their eyes, in the quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering on the hearth, the kettle singing its thin strain, a drawer or two open, papers neatly set forth on the business table, and nearer the fire the things laid out for tea. The quietest room, you would have said, and but for the glazed presses full of chemicals, the most commonplace that night in London. Right in the midst there lay a body of a man, sorely contorted and still twitching. They drew near on tiptoe, turned it on its back, and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness. The cords of his face still moved with a semblance of life, but life was quite gone. And by the crushed vial in his hand and the strong smell of kernels hanging in the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer. "We have come too late," he said, "whether to save or punish. Hyde is gone to his account, and it only remains for us to find the body of your master." The far greater proportion of the building was occupied by the theater, which filled almost the whole ground story and was lit from above, and by the cabinet, which formed an upper story at one end and looked upon the court. A corridor joined the theater to the door on the by street, and with this the cabinet communicated separately by a second flight of steps. There were besides a few dark closets and a spacious cellar. All of these they now thoroughly examined. Each closet needed but a glance, for all were empty, and by all the dust that fell from their doors had stood long unopened. The cellar, indeed, was filled with crazy lumber, mostly dating from the times of the surgeon who was Jekyll's predecessor. But even as they opened the door, they were advertised of the uselessness of further searching by the fall of a perfect mat of cobweb which had for years sealed the entrance. Nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Poole stamped on the flags of the corridor. "He must be buried here," he said, listening to the sound. "Or he may have fled," said Utterson, and he turned to examine the door in the by-street. It was locked, and lying nearby on the flags they found the key already stained with rust. "This does not look like use," said the lawyer. "Use?" said Poole. "Do you not see, sir, it is broken, much as if the man had stamped on it?" "Aye," said Utterson, "and the fractures, too, are rusted." The two men looked at each other with a scarce. "This is beyond thee, Poole," said the lawyer. "Let us go back to the cabinet." They mounted the stair in silence, and still with an occasional awe-struck glance at the dead body, proceeded more thoroughly to examine the contents of the cabinet. At one table there were traces of chemical work, various measured heaps of some white salt being laid on glass saucers, as though for an experiment in which the unhappy man had been prevented. "This is the same drug that I was always bringing him," said Poole. And even as he spoke, the kettle, with a startling noise, boiled over. This brought them to the fireside, where the easy chair was drawn cozily up, and the tea things stood ready to the sitter's elbow. The sugar was in the cup. There were several books on a shelf, and one lay beside the tea things open, and Utterson was amazed to find it a copy of a pious work, for which Jekyll had several times expressed great esteem, annotated in his own hand with startling blasphemies. Next, in the course of their review of the chamber, the searchers came to the cheval glass, into whose depths they looked with involuntary horror. But it was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof, the fire sparkling in 100 repetitions along the glazed front of the presses, and their own pale, fearful countenances stooping to look in. "This glass has seen some strange things, sir," whispered Poole. And surely none stranger than itself, said the lawyer. For what did Jekyll— He caught himself up at the word with a start, and then conquered his weakness. What could Jekyll want with that? He asked. You may say that, said Poole. Next they turned to the business table. On the desk, among the neat array of papers, a large envelope was uppermost and bore in the doctor's hand the name of Mr. Utterson. The lawyer unsealed it, and several enclosures fell to the floor. The first was a will, drawn in the same eccentric terms as the one which he had returned 6 months before, to serve as a testament in case of death and as a deed of gift in case of disappearance. But in place of the name of Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with indescribable amazement, read the name of Gabriel John Utterson. He looked at Poole and then back at the paper, and last of all at the dead malefactor stretched out across the carpet. My head goes round, he said. He has been all of these days in possession. He had no cause to like me. He must have raged to see himself displaced. And he did not destroy the document. He caught up the next paper. It was a brief note in the doctor's hand and dated at the top. Oh, Poole, said the lawyer. He was alive and here this day. He cannot have been disposed of in so short a space. He must still be alive and have fled. Where, why, and how? And in that case, can we venture to declare this? Oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe. Why don't you read it, sir? Said Poole. Because I fear, said the lawyer. God grant I have no cause. And with that, he brought the paper to his eyes and read as follows. My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared, under what circumstances I have not the penetration to foresee, but my instinct and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then, and first read the narrative which Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands, and if you care to hear more, turn to the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll. There was a third enclosure, said Utterson. Here, sir, said Poole, and gave into his hands a considerable packet sealed in several places. The lawyer put it in his pocket. I would say nothing of this paper. If your master has fled or is dead, we may at least save his credit. It is now 10. I must go home and read these documents in quiet, but I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police. They went out, locking the door of the theater behind them, and Utterson, once more leaving the servants gathered about the fire in the hall, trudged back to his office to read the two narratives in which this mystery would now be explained. And that was a much longer chapter than the first one. So yeah, I think we're going to finish this tale, not tonight, but in another night. I think it would be Friday night. So Friday night, we will be finishing The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where it's almost funny. I cannot imagine these days walking in and finding a still twitching, and that was actually the whole self-deletion thing. That was actually the phrasing in the book. That wasn't me trying to be mindful of my words. I'm reading what is written in the book. And so obviously they did not actually like saying the S word, which YouTube doesn't like, so I appreciate that. But I can't imagine walking in and finding somebody who has just erased their existence, still twitching on the floor, and not calling the police right away. That, to me, at least in this day and age, would be so suspicious. Like, the police would come and be like, wait, when did you say you found him? And how long has he been laying there? And why didn't you call us sooner? I feel like that would make Utterson and Poole the suspects in a murder. Obviously, to my modern eyes, that's what I would think anyway. But yes, we will be finishing this when next we meet. So my question to all of you is, would you like to go on and read the other 3 short stories that are in this book? There's actually a decent chunk. Our final 2 chapters will probably be a little bit longer than this one was, but we have 3 other short stories in this book, and we could just go on and read them as well. We have Fortune Wildred, the Foundling, Lizzie Lay, and the Miner's Daughters. These are all attributed to Charles Dickens, but I think I had read when I was looking these up online that the Miner's Daughters are actually written by a different author. I'll look it up a little bit more and find out the truth behind that tale. But if you would like to hear those next and finish this entire book of 4 short stories, let me know in the comments down below. Other than that, thank you for listening and have a wonderful night.